The fluorescent lights in the oncology waiting room hummed with a frequency that seemed to match the tremor in Sarah Chen's hands. She sat in a plastic chair that had molded itself to the shape of too many frightened bodies before hers, holding a folder of medical documents she could not afford to have generated in the first place. Her daughter, Emma, 6 years old with dark eyes too observant for her age, sat beside her coloring in a donated activity book, the crayons worn down to nubs. The child drew flowers, bright and impossible, as though willing beauty into a world that had shown her mostly shadows. Sarah's name was called, not loudly, but with the careful neutrality of someone who had learned not to invest emotion in outcomes they could not control. She stood, her body moving through the familiar choreography of clinic visits, and Emma followed without being told, tucking the crayons into her small backpack with the broken zipper that Sarah kept meaning to fix but never had time to address. The hallway smelled of antiseptic and the faint ghost of cafeteria food, a combination that had become as familiar to Sarah as the scent of her own skin. The doctor's office was small, made smaller by the weight of what lived inside it. Diplomas on the wall, a desk cluttered with files, a computer screen that glowed with information Sarah both needed and feared. Dr. Patel was a woman in her 50s, with kind eyes and a voice that had been trained to deliver bad news without breaking. She gestured to the chairs across from her desk, and Sarah sat, pulling Emma onto her lap even though the girl was getting too big for it. Emma's weight was real, warm, on a reminder that not everything in the world was abstract. Fear and crushing debt. The conversation that followed was not new. It was a continuation of conversations that had begun months earlier, when Sarah had first noticed the lump, when she had first heard the word biopsy, when she had first been told that the cells growing inside her breast were not the kind that would simply go away with time or hope. The cancer was aggressive. The treatment plan was aggressive in response. Surgery, chemotherapy, radiation, the full arsenal of modern medicine deployed against an enemy that had taken root in her body without permission. But medicine required money, and money was something Sarah had run out of long before the diagnosis. The insurance she had once carried through her job at the call center had vanished when the company downsized, and her position was eliminated. The temporary gigs that followed, cleaning houses, stocking shelves at night, watching other people's children while her own sat in the corner with a coloring book, none of them offered benefits. None of them paid enough to cover rent and food and the endless needs of a growing child, let alone the catastrophic expense of cancer treatment. Dr. Patel spoke carefully, her words measured and clinical, but Sarah heard them as if from underwater, distorted and heavy. The surgery could be scheduled, she said, but the hospital required a deposit. The chemotherapy regimen had been outlined, but without insurance, the cost per cycle was staggering. There were programs, assistance funds, payment plans, but each came with paperwork, waiting periods, eligibility requirements that seemed designed to exhaust the already exhausted. Sarah nodded as though she understood, as though she had a plan, as though the numbers being discussed were numbers she could somehow conjure from the thin air of her empty bank account. In truth, she had stopped listening to the specifics. Her mind had moved to the immediacy of tonight, where she and Emma would sleep now that the weekly motel room had exceeded what she could pay, to the dwindling supply of crackers and peanut butter in her backpack, to the persistent cough Emma had developed that Sarah feared was something more than a cold, but could not afford to have examined. When the appointment ended, Dr. Patel handed her a stack of pamphlets, resources, hotlines, foundations, to each one a small beacon of theoretical help that required energy Sarah no longer possessed. She thanked the doctor, her voice steady despite the collapse happening inside her chest, and led Emma back through the waiting room, past the other patients whose fears were written in the tension of their shoulders and the tightness of their jaws. Outside, the city was loud and indifferent. Cars moved through intersections without pause. People walked past without seeing her, and the sky above was the pale gray of overcast autumn, a color that felt like the inside of her thoughts. Emma tugged at her hand, asking if they could go to the park, and Sarah said yes, even though the park was just a place to sit on a bench and pretend the world was not pressing down on them with the weight of 1,000 unresolved problems. They walked 6 blocks to the small patch of green wedged between buildings, a space too small to be called a park, but labeled as one anyway. Emma ran to the swings, her laughter cutting through the heaviness for a moment, and Sarah sat on a bench, the medical folder open in her lap. She stared at the numbers, the estimates, the timelines, and felt the enormity of it crush the air from her lungs. She had $11 in her wallet, $3.47 in her checking account, and a cancer growing inside her that required tens of thousands of dollars to fight. The math did not work. It had never worked. Her phone buzzed, a text from the landlord of the room she had been renting by the week. Late again, it read. Need payment today or lock changes tomorrow. She closed her eyes and let the phone rest in her lap, unable to respond because there was no response that would change the reality. She had no money. She had no home. She had a daughter who deserved stability and a mother who could no longer provide it. When Emma returned, breathless and pink-cheeked, Sarah forced a smile and told her they were going on an adventure. The words sounded hollow even as she spoke it, but Emma's eyes lit up the way children's eyes do when they choose to believe the best version of the truth. They gathered their things, the backpack with its broken zipper, the plastic bag holding their few remaining possessions, and began walking toward the shelter on the east side of the city, the one Sarah had avoided for months because admitting she needed it felt like admitting she had failed. The shelter was full. The woman at the desk, tired and kind in equal measure, who explained that beds were assigned by lottery and tonight's slots were gone. She could put Sarah's name on the waiting list, she said, but there were no guarantees. Families with children were prioritized, but even priorities had limits when the need exceeded the space. Sarah thanked her, took the intake form she did not have the energy to fill out, and walked back into the cooling evening with Emma's small hand in hers. They spent the night in the doorway of a closed laundromat, Sarah's jacket spread over Emma like a blanket, her own body curled around her daughter to keep her warm. The concrete was cold and unforgiving, and every sound made Sarah flinch. The footsteps of strangers, the rattle of a shopping cart, the distant wail of sirens. She did not sleep. She counted Emma's breaths instead, each one a small miracle, and each one a reminder of why she could not give up, even when giving up felt like the only rational response to the cruelty of her circumstances. Morning came gray and damp, the city waking with the groan of traffic and the clatter of opening shop gates. Sarah's body ached, her back stiff from the hard ground, and when she stood, pulling Emma gently awake, she felt decades older than her 32 years. They walked to a public restroom in a park where Sarah washed their faces with cold water and tried to make them look presentable, as though appearances still mattered when survival was measured in hours, not days. She spent the morning at the library, using the free computers, to search for anything, any opportunity, any lifeline that might appear in the digital void. Job postings required addresses she did not have, and apartments required deposits she could not pay. Aid programs had waiting lists that stretched months into a future she might not see. Her searches grew more desperate, more abstract, until she found herself scrolling through estate auctions, foreclosure sales, listings for properties so damaged or remote that no one wanted them. That was when she saw it. A single line of text in a forum for survivalists and urban explorers, buried beneath arguments about water filtration and canned goods. Decommissioned military facility, the post read. Northern County, condemned, no utilities, extreme disrepair. Auctioned by county for unpaid taxes. Starting bid $1. No one wants it. Too far, too broken. The post had been made weeks earlier, mocked by other users who called it a waste of time, a death trap, a monument to government negligence. But to Sarah, staring at the words on the screen, it looked like something else. It looked like a possibility. She copied the auction details into a scrap of paper, her handwriting shaky from exhaustion and the tremor that had settled into her fingers since the diagnosis. The auction was scheduled for that afternoon at the county administrative building, a place she could reach by bus if she spent the last few dollars she had on fare. The rational part of her mind screamed that this was foolish, that a condemned military facility was not a home, that $1 was still $1 she could not afford to lose. But the desperate part of her mind, the part that had carried her through the loss of her job, the diagnosis, the homelessness, that part whispered that she had nothing left to lose, and maybe, just maybe, a roof over Emma's head, even a broken one, was better than sleeping in doorways. She gathered Emma, who had been reading quietly in the children's section, and they boarded the bus that would take them north to the county offices. The ride was long, winding through neighborhoods that grew sparser and poorer as the city gave way to industrial zones, and then to stretches of land that looked forgotten. Emma pressed her face to the window, watching the landscape shift, asking questions Sarah answered as best as she could, her mind already calculating what came next. The county administrative building was a low, gray structure that looked as though it had been designed to discourage hope. Inside, the air was stale, the fluorescent lights flickering in a rhythm that felt almost hostile. Sarah approached the desk, asked about the auction, and was directed to a room down a narrow hallway where 3 other people sat in folding chairs, each of them looking as though they, too, had arrived at the end of a long series of bad decisions. The auctioneer was a man in his 60s, bored and mechanical, reading property descriptions from a clipboard with the enthusiasm of someone reciting grocery lists. When he reached the military facility, his voice did not change. Lot 47, he said. Former communications outpost, decommissioned 1987, condemned 2003. No access to water, power, or sewage. Extensive structural damage. Sold as is. No warranties. No inspections. Starting bid $1. Sarah's hand rose before she fully understood what she was doing. The auctioneer paused, looked at her with something between pity and confusion, and said, "Going once." No one else moved. Going twice. The room remained silent. Sold for $1. The paperwork was minimal, a transfer of deed, a liability waiver, a signature that bound her to a property she had never seen and knew almost nothing about. She paid with a single crumpled dollar bill, the last one in her wallet, and the clerk handed her a folder containing a deed, a map, and a warning printed in bold letters. Property is unsafe for habitation. Enter at your own risk. County assumes no responsibility for injury or death. Sarah folded the papers into her backpack and walked out of the building with Emma beside her, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the parking lot. She had no plan, no clear understanding of what she had just done, but she had a piece of paper that said she owned something, and that was more than she had owned an hour earlier. The bus ride back to the city felt different, lighter somehow, as though the act of acquiring the property, however absurd, had shifted the weight she carried just enough to let her breathe. That evening, sitting on the steps of the library before it closed, she unfolded the map and studied the location. The facility was remote, accessible only by a dirt road that branched off a rural highway nearly 40 miles from the city, The map showed a cluster of buildings, labeled vaguely as barracks, administration, and storage, surrounded by fencing that the county had noted was mostly collapsed. There were no photographs, no descriptions beyond the stark warnings, but Sarah traced the lines with her finger and felt something she had not felt in months. Not hope exactly, but the faint outline of it, the shape of a future that was not simply waiting to collapse. She used the library computer one last time, searching for information about the facility. What she found was sparse, mentions in declassified documents about Cold War-era communications, a brief reference in a local history blog about military installations, abandoned after budget cuts, a few grainy photographs from the 1980s showing blocky concrete structures and satellite dishes long since removed. The place had been forgotten, erased from relevance, left to rot in the silence of bureaucratic indifference. But to Sarah, it was not nothing. It was a place no one else wanted, which meant it was a place no one would take from her. It was shelter, however broken, and shelter was what she and Emma needed more than anything else in the world. The question now was how to get there, how to make it livable, how to survive long enough to see whether this gamble would save them or simply delay the inevitable. She spent the next 2 days preparing, though preparation with no money meant scavenging and asking for help from the few people who still remembered her from better times. A former co-worker gave her a sleeping bag and a flashlight. A church outreach program provided a box of canned goods and a gallon of water. A man at the bus station, overhearing her ask about routes to the northern county, offered to drive her part way in exchange for help unloading a truck, and she accepted, grateful for any reduction in the impossible distance between here and there. On the third day, she and Emma stood at the edge of the highway, their belongings packed into 2 bags that felt heavier than their combined contents should allow. The man from the bus station, true to his word, pulled over in a rusted pickup truck and gestured for them to climb in. The drive took nearly 2 hours, winding through farmland and forest, past towns too small to have names on the map, until finally he turned onto a dirt road, so overgrown it barely qualified as a road at all. He stopped where the road forked, pointing toward a path that disappeared into the trees. "That's as far as I go," he said, not unkindly. "You sure about this?" Sarah nodded, thanked him, and helped Emma down from the truck. They watched him drive away, the sound of the engine fading until only the forest remained, silent and vast, pressing in from all sides. The walk to the facility took another hour, and the path uneven and choked with weeds, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and rotting leaves. Emma complained once, her small voice asking how much longer, and Sarah promised they were almost there, though she had no idea if that was true. When the trees finally opened into a clearing, Sarah stopped, her breath catching in her throat. The facility was worse than she had imagined. The main building was a low concrete structure, its walls stained with rust and mold, its windows shattered or missing entirely. The roof sagged in places, and vines had claimed the exterior, crawling up the walls and through cracks in the foundation. Surrounding it were smaller buildings in various states of collapse, their roofs caved in, their walls crumbling, and everywhere the evidence of abandonment, rusted equipment, broken fencing, debris scattered like the bones of something long dead. For a moment, Sarah felt the full weight of her mistake. This was not a home. This was a grave, a place where hope came to die. But then Emma tugged at her hand, her voice small but steady. "Is this ours, Mama?" And Sarah, looking down at her daughter's upturned face, forced herself to nod. "Yes," she said. "This is ours." They approached the main building slowly, stepping carefully over rubble and broken glass. The front door hung loose on its hinges, and Sarah pushed it open with a creak that echoed through the empty interior. Inside, the air was cold and stale, thick with dust that rose in clouds with every step. The floor was concrete, cracked and uneven, and the walls were bare, stripped of anything valuable long before Sarah had arrived. The space was vast, open, and designed for function rather than comfort, and it felt less like a building than a tomb. Sarah set down their bags and walked through the rooms, her footsteps hollow in the silence. Most were empty, littered with debris, old furniture too broken to salvage, papers yellowed and illegible, the remnants of a life that had moved on without looking back. In one room, she found a rusted metal desk. In another, a filing cabinet tipped on its side, drawers open and empty. The deeper she went, the more oppressive the silence became, as though the building itself was holding its breath, waiting to see if she would stay or run. Emma stayed close, her small hand gripping Sarah's jacket, and together they made their way to what looked like a common area, a large room with high ceilings and a concrete floor, and it was here that Sarah decided they would sleep, at least for tonight. She spread the sleeping bag on the ground, opened the box of canned goods, and handed Emma a granola bar from the dwindling supply. They ate in silence, the only sound the faint drip of water somewhere deeper in the building, a reminder that the structure was not sealed, not protected, not safe. As night fell, the temperature dropped, and Sarah realized with a sinking feeling that they had no heat, no way to warm themselves beyond the sleeping bag and their own body heat. She pulled Emma close, wrapping her arms around her daughter, and tried to ignore the cold seeping up through the concrete, the ache in her bones, the fear that she had made a terrible mistake. But as she lay there in the darkness, listening to Emma's breathing slow into the rhythm of sleep, Sarah felt something shift inside her. Yes, the building was broken. Yes, they had no power, no water, no clear path forward. But they also had walls, however crumbling, and a roof, however damaged. They had a place that belonged to them, a place no landlord could evict them from, a place where they could rest without fear of being chased away. It was not much, it was barely anything. But it was more than they had yesterday, and in the mathematics of survival, that difference was everything. Sarah closed her eyes, her hand resting on Emma's sleeping form, and made a silent promise. She would make this work. She would find a way to turn this ruin into a home. She would fight the cancer. She would protect her daughter. And she would prove that even $1 could buy a future if you were desperate enough to believe in it. The next morning came pale and cold, light filtering through the broken windows and dusty beams that illuminated the decay Sarah had not fully seen the night before. She woke stiff and sore, her body protesting the hardness of the concrete floor, but she forced herself to stand, to stretch, to begin the work of understanding what she had purchased. Emma still slept, curled in the sleeping bag like a small animal burrowed against the cold, and Sarah let her rest while she explored further. The facility was larger than she had realized, a sprawling complex of interconnected buildings and tunnels. Some collapsed, others still intact enough to walk through. She moved carefully, testing each step before committing her weight, aware that the structure had been condemned for good reason. In some rooms, the walls were cracked so severely she could see daylight through them. In others, the ceiling hung low, sagging under the weight of water damage and time. But as she walked, she also began to see possibilities. One room had intact walls and a door that still closed, a space that could be sealed off and made warmer than the rest. Another had shelves built into the walls, storage that could hold their few possessions. A third had a small window with glass still in the frame, a luxury she had not expected. None of it was ideal. None of it was safe by any standard definition. But it was structure. And structure was the beginning of survival. She returned to the common area where Emma was waking, rubbing her eyes and asking for breakfast. Sarah opened another can from their supplies, peaches this time, and they shared the sweet fruit, savoring each bite as though it were a feast. Emma did not complain about the cold or the emptiness of the building. She simply ate, then asked if she could explore, and Sarah said yes, warning her to stay close and avoid any rooms that looked dangerous. While Emma wandered, examining the strange space with the curiosity of a child who had not yet learned to fear the unknown, Sarah continued her survey of the property. She walked outside, circling the main building, noting the places where the foundation had cracked, where the walls had crumbled, where vines had pushed through concrete with a force that spoke to the relentlessness of nature, reclaiming what humans had abandoned. It was during this circuit that she noticed something strange. At the far end of the complex, partially hidden by overgrown brush and fallen debris, and there was a section of the building that looked different from the rest. The walls here were thicker, the construction heavier, and the entrance, a reinforced steel door, was still intact, though rusted and covered in layers of grime. She approached it slowly, curiosity pulling her forward despite the voice in her head that warned her to be careful. The door was locked, not with a traditional lock, but with a heavy metal bar that had been welded into place, as though whoever had sealed it wanted to ensure it stayed sealed. Sarah ran her hands along the edges, feeling the cold metal beneath her fingers, and wondered what lay beyond. The rest of the facility had been stripped bare, anything of value long since removed. But this door suggested something different, something that had been deliberately protected or hidden. She tried to pull the bar free, but it did not budge. Years of rust had fused it to the frame, and without tools, she had no way to force it open. She stepped back, studying the door, the thick walls, the reinforced construction, and felt a flicker of unease. Why seal one section of an abandoned facility so thoroughly? What had been stored here that required such protection? The questions followed her back to the common area, where Emma was drawing pictures in the dust on the floor, her small hands creating patterns and shapes that faded as quickly as they appeared. Sarah sat beside her, watching the light shift through the broken windows, and tried to push the thoughts of the sealed door from her mind. She had more immediate concerns: food, water, warmth, than the basics of survival that would determine whether they could stay here or whether the cold and hunger would drive them back to the streets. Over the next few days, Sarah fell into a rhythm, a pattern of work that kept despair at bay. She scavenged materials from the collapsed buildings, dragging broken boards and sheets of metal to the common area to create barriers against the wind. She found a tarp in one of the storage rooms, torn but still usable, and stretched it over the window frames to keep out the worst of the cold. She rationed their food carefully, making each can last longer than it should, supplementing their diet with wild berries she recognized from childhood hikes, though the season was late and the pickings sparse. Emma helped where she could, her small hands carrying stones to weigh down the tarp, on her voice filling the silence with questions and observations that reminded Sarah why she was fighting. At night, they huddled together in the sleeping bag, their breath visible in the cold air, and Sarah told stories, not of their current reality, but of futures she could barely imagine, futures where Emma went to school and had friends and did not have to worry about where they would sleep or when they would eat. But even as she worked to make the facility livable, Sarah could not stop thinking about the sealed door. It pulled at her, a mystery she did not have time to solve but could not ignore. On the fourth day, she returned to it, this time bringing a piece of rebar she had found among the debris. She wedged it under the metal bar and used her full weight to pry, muscles straining, breath coming in sharp bursts. The metal groaned, rust flaking away in orange clouds, and with a sudden crack, the bar shifted. She worked it back and forth, her hands blistering from the effort, until finally the bar came free, clattering to the ground with a sound that echoed through the clearing. The door was still locked, but the lock was old, corroded, and when she struck it hard with the rebar, It shattered, pieces of metal falling away to reveal darkness beyond. Sarah hesitated, her heart pounding not from exertion, but from something else, a mixture of fear and anticipation. She called for Emma, who came running, and together they stood before the open doorway, staring into the blackness that waited inside. Sarah raised the flashlight, its beam cutting through the dark, and stepped forward. Emma close behind, their footsteps echoing in the hollow space. The passage beyond was narrow, lined with concrete walls that felt colder than the rest of the building, and it sloped downward, leading deeper into the earth. The air was different here, stale and heavy, as though it had been sealed for decades. Sarah moved slowly, the flashlight beam sweeping back and forth, revealing a corridor that seemed to go on far longer than should have been possible given the size of the building above. After 50 feet, the corridor ended at another door, this one also steel, but without the bar. It had a wheel lock, the kind Sarah had seen in old war movies, thick and industrial, designed to seal spaces airtight. She gripped the wheel and turned, expecting resistance, but to her surprise it moved, stiff but functional, and with a final effort, she felt the locks disengage. The door swung inward with a hiss, as though the pressure inside had been held for years, and beyond it lay something Sarah had not expected. A bunker. Not a small room or a storage closet, but a vast underground chamber. The walls lined with metal shelves, the ceiling high and reinforced with beams that suggested this place had been built to withstand more than time. The air inside was cool but dry, preserved by the seal that had kept the outside world at bay. Sarah stepped inside, her flashlight beam sweeping across rows of boxes, crates, equipment covered in tarps, and in the center of the room, a series of metal containers stacked neatly, each one labeled with faded stencils she could not yet read. Emma's small voice broke the silence. "Mama, what is this place?" Sarah did not answer immediately. She walked deeper into the bunker, her mind racing to make sense of what she was seeing. This was not just a storage room. This was something else, something that had been hidden deliberately, something that had been sealed to protect it or to hide it from the world above. She approached the nearest container, brushing dust from the label, and felt her breath catch as the words became clear. Property of U.S. government, classified. Do not remove. Her hands trembled as she lifted the lid, the metal hinges protesting, but giving way. And inside, stacked in neat rows, were bundles of currency, old bills wrapped in plastic, preserved as though they had been placed there yesterday. Sarah stared, unable to process what she was seeing, her mind refusing to accept the reality of it. She lifted one bundle, felt its weight, the density of paper compressed and sealed, and knew with a certainty that made her dizzy that this was real. This was money, a lot of money, hidden in a bunker beneath a facility no one cared about, a facility she had bought for $1 because no one else wanted it. She set the bundle down carefully, as though it might vanish if handled too roughly, and moved to the next container. Inside were more bundles, and beyond that, boxes labeled with codes she did not understand, equipment wrapped in protective coverings, documents sealed in waterproof cases. The bunker was full, a repository of things that had been meant to stay hidden, things that someone, decades ago, had decided were too valuable or too dangerous to leave exposed. Sarah sank to her knees, the flashlight beam trembling in her hand, and for the first time in months, she allowed herself to cry. Not from despair, not from fear, but from the overwhelming realization that the gamble she had taken, the foolish, desperate decision to spend her last dollar on a condemned building, had just changed everything. She did not know yet what all of this meant, did not know if the money was legal to keep or if the government would come for it, did not know if this discovery was a blessing or a curse. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty. Her daughter would not sleep on concrete tonight. Her daughter would not go hungry tomorrow. And the cancer growing inside her would not win because she could not afford to fight it. The bunker had revealed its secret, and with it, the possibility of a future Sarah had thought was lost forever. She pulled Emma close, holding her daughter in the cold underground chamber surrounded by shadows and secrets, and whispered words she had not believed in months. "We're going to be okay." Sarah did not move for several minutes, her arms wrapped around Emma in the dim underground chamber, the reality of what she had found pressing against her mind, with a weight that felt almost physical. The bundles of currency stacked in the metal container seemed to pulse in the flashlight beam, not with light, but with possibility, with the transformation of everything she had believed about her life and what came next. Emma, too young to understand the magnitude of what surrounded them, simply leaned against her mother's chest, her small fingers tracing patterns on Sarah's jacket. When Sarah finally stood, her legs unsteady beneath her, she forced herself to think methodically, to push past the shock and move toward understanding. She could not afford to let emotion cloud her judgment. Not now. Not when the stakes had shifted from survival to something far more complex. She moved deeper into the bunker, the flashlight beam sweeping across shelves and containers, revealing the scope of what had been hidden here. The bunker was larger than the common area above ground, extending back into the earth in a series of connected chambers. The walls were reinforced concrete, thick and solid, designed to withstand forces Sarah could only imagine. The air circulation system, though silent now, suggested the space had once been meant for long-term occupation, a shelter built during an era when the threat of nuclear war had been real enough to justify such expense. But this was more than a shelter. It was a vault, and what it contained went far beyond emergency supplies. But Sarah opened the second container, her hands moving with a careful reverence she had not known she possessed. Inside were more bundles of currency, older bills this time, their designs unfamiliar, printed in denominations she had to squint to read. Some bore dates from the 1950s and 60s, others from the 70s and 80s, all of them wrapped in protective plastic that had kept them pristine, despite the decades of isolation. She counted the bundles in the first layer, multiplied by what she guessed were the layers beneath, and felt her mind reject the numbers that emerged. Hundreds of thousands, possibly millions. All of it sitting in a bunker beneath a building no one had cared about for 20 years. The third container held something different. Not currency, but bonds. Treasury bonds issued by the United States government. Each one stamped with official seals and signatures, each one representing a promise of payment that had compounded over decades. Sarah lifted one carefully, studying the intricate printing, the raised seal, the serial numbers that ran along the edges. She had no idea what they were worth now, but the denominations printed on their faces alone were staggering. $10,000, $25,000, $50,000, and there were dozens of them, maybe hundreds, stacked neatly in folders that bore labels she could barely read in the dim light. She moved to the shelves, where boxes of varying sizes sat in orderly rows. Some contained equipment, radios, and instruments, whose purposes she could not guess. Others held documents sealed in waterproof cases, thick folders of papers that looked official, government stamped, classified in ways that made her uneasy. She opened one case carefully, pulling out a folder marked with red letters that read, "Confidential Disbursement Records." Inside were ledgers, handwritten entries detailing transactions, transfers, allocations of funds to projects with code names that meant nothing to her. Black Mountain, Copper Shield, Silent Fortress. Each entry was accompanied by dollar amounts that made her hands shake as she read them. This was not just hidden money. This was something that had been deliberately concealed, moved off official records, buried in a place no one was meant to find. The realization settled over her like a cold weight. Whoever had put this here had done so with intention, with the belief that it needed to be kept secret, perhaps even illegal. Sarah closed the folder, her breath shallow, and looked around the bunker with new eyes. This was not a gift. This was a complication, a danger wrapped in the illusion of salvation. Emma's voice pulled her back to the present. "Mama, I'm cold." Sarah turned, seeing her daughter huddled near the entrance, her small body shivering in the chill of the underground air. The bunker, for all its treasures, offered no warmth, no comfort beyond the abstract promise of wealth. Sarah moved quickly, guiding Emma back toward the door, the flashlight beam leading them through the corridor and up into the main building, where the broken windows at least allowed daylight to filter through. They returned to the common area, and Sarah wrapped Emma in the sleeping bag, pulling her close and rubbing her arms to generate warmth. The child asked what they had found, and Sarah struggled to find words that would make sense. "Supplies," she said finally. "Things that were left here a long time ago. Things that might help us." Emma accepted this without question, the way children accept the inexplicable, and soon fell asleep, exhausted by the cold and the strangeness of their new home. Sarah sat beside her, staring at the cracked ceiling, her mind racing through scenarios, possibilities, dangers. The money and bonds in the bunker were worth more than she could fully comprehend, enough to pay for her treatment, to buy a real home, to give Emma a future without fear or hunger. But taking them, using them, came with risks she could not ignore. The bunker had been sealed for a reason. The documents were marked classified. If this money belonged to the government, or if it had been hidden as part of some operation or cover-up, then claiming it could bring consequences far worse than poverty. Yet the alternative was to leave it there, to pretend she had never found it, to continue living in the ruins above while a fortune sat untouched beneath her feet. The thought was absurd, almost offensive in its futility. She had bought this property legally. The deed was in her name. Whatever had been left here, abandoned for decades, belonged to her now, at least in the most practical sense. The question wasn't whether she had the right to it, but whether she could keep it without destroying herself in the process. The next morning, Sarah made a decision. She would not act rashly, would not rush to spend or reveal what she had found. First, she needed to understand exactly what was in the bunker, to document it, to assess its value with precision. Only then could she decide how to move forward. She left Emma sleeping and returned to the bunker, this time bringing a notebook and pen she had found in one of the abandoned offices, and spent hours cataloging the contents. 23 containers of currency, estimated total, based on bundle counts and denominations, between $12 and $18 million. 78 treasury bonds, matured and compounded, estimated value pending verification, but potentially tens of millions more. 16 boxes of documents, some financial, some operational, all classified. 7 crates of equipment, purpose unknown. 3 sealed metal cases, locked, contents unidentified. She wrote it all down, her handwriting precise despite the tremor in her hands. And when she finally emerged from the bunker, the sun was low in the sky, and her daughter was awake, asking for food. They ate the last of the canned peaches, and Sarah realized with a sinking feeling that their supplies were nearly gone. The money in the bunker was useless if she could not convert it into food, into heat, into the things they needed to survive today, not tomorrow. She needed to act, but carefully, testing the waters before diving in fully. That evening, She took one of the smallest bundles of currency from the bunker, a stack of $50 bills wrapped in plastic, and tucked it into her jacket. The next day, she would go into town, buy food and supplies, and see if anyone questioned the money, if anyone recognized it as something that should not exist. The walk to the nearest town took 3 hours, when Emma's small legs struggling to keep pace, and by the time they reached the cluster of buildings that barely qualified as a town, Sarah was exhausted, her back aching from the cancer that never let her forget its presence. The general store was small, dusty, run by a man in his 70s, who looked at Sarah and Emma with the kind of suspicion reserved for strangers who appeared out of nowhere. She bought bread, milk, canned goods, batteries, a box of matches, the essentials she had not been able to afford in weeks. When she handed the man a $50 bill to pay, he held it up to the light, studying it as though it might be counterfeit. The bill was old, printed in the 1980s, but it was real, legal, tender, and after a moment he grunted and made change without comment. Sarah took the coins and small bills he returned, her heart pounding, and left the store with Emma and their bags of supplies. No one had questioned her. No alarms had been raised. The money, despite its age, was still money, still accepted, still functional in the world above ground. The realization was both a relief and a new source of anxiety. If she could spend it, she could survive. But spending too much too quickly would draw attention, and attention was the last thing she could afford. Over the following weeks, Sarah established a routine. She made small trips to town, never buying more than she needed, never using bills larger than 50s, always paying in cash and leaving before anyone could ask where she had come from or why she was living in a condemned military facility. She used the money to buy tarps and plywood, nails and tools, slowly transforming the common area into something resembling a livable space. She patched holes in the walls, sealed windows with plastic sheeting, built a makeshift stove from scavenged metal that allowed her to heat water and cook simple meals. Emma, for her part, adapted with the resilience of children. She explored the facility during the day, creating games among the ruins, collecting stones and sticks, and arranging them into patterns only she understood. She asked fewer questions as time went on, accepting their strange home as simply the place they lived, the place that was theirs. At night, Sarah read to her from books bought in town, stories of adventure and magic that felt both distant and oddly appropriate, given the treasure hidden beneath their feet. But even as Sarah worked to make the facility habitable, she could not stop thinking about the full extent of what lay in the bunker. The bonds, in particular, haunted her. If they were legitimate, if they had matured over decades, as the documents suggested, they could be worth exponentially more than the currency. But bonds required verification, redemption through official channels, and that meant exposing herself to scrutiny she had so far avoided. One evening, after Emma had fallen asleep, Sarah sat at the makeshift desk she had built from crates and studied the bonds by candlelight. She had pulled several from the bunker, the ones with the earliest issue dates, and traced her fingers over the ornate printing, the government seals, the signatures of officials long dead. There were instructions printed on the back, procedures for redemption, on contact information for treasury offices that might no longer exist. The bonds were real, she was certain of that. But whether they could be redeemed without triggering an investigation was a question she could not answer alone. She needed advice, expertise, someone who could tell her what these bonds were worth and how to claim them without destroying her life in the process. But who could she trust? Anyone she approached with questions about decades-old government bonds would ask where she had gotten them, and the truth, that she had found them in a sealed bunker beneath a condemned military facility, was a truth that invited complications she could not predict. The decision came slowly, over days of internal debate and sleepless nights. She would approach someone, but not locally, not in the small town where her presence was already drawing faint notice. She would go to the city, find a financial expert, someone who dealt in antiquities and unusual assets, and present the bonds as something she had inherited, a half-truth that avoided the full complexity of the bunker and what it represented. The trip to the city required leaving Emma behind, a choice that tore at Sarah's heart, but felt necessary. She could not risk bringing her daughter into a situation that might go wrong, could not expose her to danger Sarah herself did not fully understand. She arranged for a neighbor, a woman she had met briefly in town, to watch Emma for the day, paying her with cash and a story about needing to visit a doctor, which was true enough to avoid suspicion. Sarah rode the bus back to the city she had fled weeks earlier, the same city where she had been homeless, where she had slept in doorways and counted her last dollars. But now she sat with a small leather case in her lap. Inside it, 3 of the Treasury bonds, each one representing a value she hoped would change everything. The city looked different through her eyes now, not hostile, but filled with opportunities she had been too desperate to see before. She found the office through an internet search at the library, a firm that specialized in estate valuations and historical financial instruments. The building was downtown, glass and steel, intimidating in its modernity. Sarah hesitated outside, looking at her reflection in the glass, seeing a woman still too thin, still wearing clothes that had seen better days, still carrying the marks of poverty despite the fortune she had stumbled into. But she forced herself forward, pushed through the doors, and approached the receptionist with a confidence she did not feel. She asked to speak with someone about historical bonds, and after a brief wait, was led to an office where a man in his 50s, graying at the temples and wearing a suit that cost more than Sarah had owned in her entire life, introduced himself as Richard Brennan, senior appraiser. He gestured for her to sit, his manner polite but clinical, and asked what he could help her with. Sarah opened the leather case and placed the bonds on his desk. "I inherited these," she said, keeping her voice steady. "I need to know if they're worth anything." Brennan's expression shifted as he picked up the first bond, his eyes narrowing, his fingers moving with practiced precision as he examined the paper. The seals, the serial numbers. He said nothing for a long moment, then reached for a magnifying glass and studied the bond more closely. "Where did you say you got these?" he asked, not looking up. Sarah had prepared for this question. "My grandmother," she said. "She passed away and left them in a safe deposit box. I didn't know they existed until I went through her things." The lie felt thin in her mouth, but Brennan nodded, still focused on the bonds. He set the first one down and picked up the second, repeating the examination. Then the third, his expression growing more serious with each one. Finally, he looked up at her, his eyes sharp. "These are genuine," he said. United States Treasury bonds, issued in the 1960s and 70s, matured decades ago. The serial numbers match the government's records for that era. The paper, the ink, the seals, all authentic. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. "What are they worth?" she asked, trying to keep her voice neutral. Brennan leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "At face value, these 3 bonds total $75,000. But because they've matured and been accruing interest for 50-plus years, the current value is significantly higher." He paused, as if calculating, then met her eyes. "Conservatively, these 3 bonds are worth approximately $210,000, if redeemed through the proper channels." The room seemed to tilt, and Sarah gripped the edge of the desk to steady herself. $210,000 for 3 bonds, and she had 78 more in the bunker. The numbers spiraled in her mind, too large to process fully, too transformative to believe. Brennan continued, his tone shifting to something more cautious. However, I need to inform you that redeeming bonds of this age and value will require verification with the Treasury Department. There will be paperwork, background checks, and questions about provenance. If these bonds were part of a government program or classified operation, there may be complications. Sarah's stomach tightened. What kind of complications? Brennan shrugged slightly. It depends on the origin. If they were legitimately issued and simply forgotten, redemption should be straightforward, though it may take months. If they were part of something less transparent, the government may contest ownership or demand an investigation. It's rare, but not unheard of. Sarah nodded slowly, her mind already racing ahead. She could not redeem all the bonds at once, could not risk drawing that level of scrutiny. But if she moved carefully, redeeming a few at a time, spacing out the transactions, perhaps she could avoid triggering the alarms Brennan was hinting at. "Thank you," she said, reaching for the bonds. Brennan held up a hand. "If you'd like, I can assist with the redemption process. My firm handles these kinds of transactions regularly, and we have established relationships with the Treasury Department. It would cost you a percentage, but it might smooth the process." "How much of a percentage?" Sarah asked. Brennan smiled faintly. 10% of the redeemed value, standard for complex estate assets. Sarah did the math quickly. 10% of $210,000 was $21,000, a fee that would have been unthinkable weeks ago, but now felt almost reasonable given what was at stake. She nodded. "I'll think about it," she said. "Can I leave these with you to start the process?" Brennan's smile widened slightly. "Of course. I'll need some documentation from you. Proof of inheritance, identification, that sort of thing. But we can begin the preliminary verification immediately." Sarah hesitated, the request for documentation a reminder that every step forward carried risk. But she also knew that without taking risks, the bonds were just paper, and paper would not save her daughter or cure her cancer. She provided what she could: a copy of her ID, a fabricated story about her grandmother's estate, enough to satisfy Brennan's initial requirements without exposing the truth. He assured her he would be in touch within the week, and Sarah left the office with a lightness in her step she had not felt in months. For $210,000. It was not the full fortune hidden in the bunker, not even close, but it was enough. Enough to start treatment, to rent a real home, to give Emma stability while Sarah figured out how to handle the rest. The bus ride back to the facility felt shorter, the landscape outside the window less oppressive. When she arrived and saw Emma waiting for her, the child running into her arms with a joy that made Sarah's chest ache, she allowed herself to believe, truly believe, that they had turned a corner. The bunker had given them more than treasure. It had given them a future. But as Sarah lay beside Emma that night, listening to the wind rattle the patched windows, she could not shake the unease that lingered at the edges of her relief. The bonds were real. The money was real. But so were the dangers. The documents in the bunker, the classified markings, the deliberate concealment of so much wealth, all pointed to something larger than a forgotten cache. Someone had hidden this for a reason, and if that someone, or their successors, ever learned what Sarah had found, the consequences could be catastrophic. She would have to be careful, more careful than she had ever been in her life. The treasure beneath her feet was both salvation and sword, and how she wielded it would determine whether it saved her family or destroyed them. For now, she focused on the immediate. The bonds Brennan was processing would bring enough money to start her treatment, to secure their survival. The rest, the millions still hidden in the bunker, could wait. Patience, she told herself, was the price of safety. But even as she formed that thought, she felt the pull of the bunker below, the weight of all that remained undiscovered, and knew that her journey into its secrets had only just begun. In the days following her meeting with Brennan, Sarah threw herself into the work of making the facility livable, not just as a temporary shelter, but as a home. The initial shock of the bunker's discovery had given way to a strange kind of determination, a belief that if she could just control the environment around her, she could control the chaos that threatened to consume everything. She used more of the currency from the bunker, pulling small amounts each week, never enough to attract attention, but enough to buy what they needed. Lumber from a hardware store 2 towns over, insulation that she stuffed into the walls of the common area, creating a barrier against the cold that crept in with each passing night. A small portable heater that ran on propane, expensive but necessary as autumn deepened toward winter. Slowly, room by room, the facility transformed. What had been a concrete tomb became something warmer, something that held the shape of a life being rebuilt. Emma thrived in ways Sarah had not expected. The girl had spent so much of her young life in cramped rooms and crowded shelters, always aware of the tension in her mother's body, the fear that tomorrow would bring eviction or worse. But here, in the vast emptiness of the old military complex, she had space to run, to imagine, to be a child, without the weight of adult fears pressing down on her. She named the different buildings, called the collapsed barracks the castle and the administration building the library, even though its shelves held nothing but dust and broken furniture. She created stories about the people who had lived here before, soldiers and scientists and adventurers, tales that Sarah encouraged because they filled the silence with something other than worry. But even as their daily life found a rhythm, Sarah could not escape the reality of what lay beneath. The bunker called to her, not with sound, but with presence, a gravitational pull she felt every time she walked through the common area, knowing that just below the concrete floor, wealth beyond comprehension waited in the dark. She had not returned to catalog the remaining containers, had not opened the locked metal cases, had not read more than a fraction of the classified documents, so part of her feared what she might find. Part of her simply lacked the energy, her body growing weaker as the cancer progressed, untreated. The call from Brennan came on a Tuesday morning, his voice crackling through the cheap cell phone Sarah had purchased in town. The verification process for the 3 bonds was complete, he said, and the Treasury Department had approved their redemption. The funds would be transferred to an account of her choosing within 10 business days, minus his firm's fee. The total, after deductions, was $189,000. Sarah sat down hard on the crate she had been using as a chair, the number repeating in her mind like a prayer. $189,000. It was more money than she had ever imagined having, more than her parents had earned in their lifetimes, and more than she had believed possible when she stood in that auction room and raised her hand for $1. Brennan asked if she wanted to proceed with redeeming more bonds, and Sarah hesitated. The caution she had felt earlier returned, whispering that moving too quickly would expose her, that greed was the enemy of survival. "Not yet," she told him. "Let me see how this one goes first." Brennan acknowledged her decision with professional detachment and ended the call. Sarah sat for a long time afterward, staring at the phone, feeling the weight of the decision she had made and the ones still to come. The money would save her. She was certain of that. It would pay for the surgery, the chemotherapy, the medications that stood between her and the cancer's victory. But it would also tie her to the bonds, to the bunker, onto a story she had only begun to tell and whose ending she could not yet see. She used the waiting period to plan. The first priority was medical care, not just for herself, but for Emma, who had been coughing more frequently, a wet sound, that worried Sarah even as she tried to convince herself it was just a cold. She researched oncologists, hospitals, treatment centers, places where the quality of care was high and questions about payment were less invasive. She learned the language of insurance, of payment plans, of how to present herself as someone who had come into money legitimately, through inheritance. Nothing unusual, nothing suspicious. When the funds finally appeared in the account she had opened under Brennan's guidance, Sarah stood in the bank, staring at the balance on the screen, and felt tears she had held back for weeks finally break free. The teller, a young woman with kind eyes, asked if she was all right, and Sarah nodded, unable to speak. She withdrew $5,000 in cash, enough to cover immediate expenses without carrying too much, and left the bank with the weight of bills in her purse feeling like an anchor, grounding her to a reality she still struggled to believe. The first appointment with the oncologist was scheduled for the following week. Sarah used some of the money to buy new clothes for herself and Emma, nothing extravagant, just clean, presentable outfits that would not mark them as people living on the margins. She bought shoes that fit, a warm coat for Emma, a bag that did not have broken zippers or fraying straps. When she looked at herself in the mirror of the thrift store dressing room, she saw someone who could pass for normal, someone who belonged in the world of doctors' offices and proper addresses. The oncologist, a woman named Dr. Vasquez, was thorough and direct. She reviewed the scans Sarah had brought from her earlier diagnosis, asked questions about symptoms and family history, and then laid out a treatment plan that was aggressive but offered real hope. Surgery to remove the tumor, followed by chemotherapy to target any remaining cancer cells, then radiation as a final measure. The cost was staggering, even with the negotiated rates Dr. Vasquez's office could offer. But Sarah had the money now, and for the first time in months, the word yes did not feel like a luxury she could not afford. They scheduled the surgery for 3 weeks out, giving Sarah time to arrange care for Emma and to prepare herself mentally for the ordeal ahead. She left the office with a folder full of instructions and a lightness in her chest that felt almost dangerous, as though allowing herself to hope might invite the universe to snatch it away. But the hope persisted, carried by the knowledge that she had done what months ago had seemed impossible. She had found a way to fight back. Yet even as her medical future clarified, the questions about the bunker deepened. In the evenings, after Emma had fallen asleep, Sarah found herself drawn back to the underground chamber, descending the concrete corridor with a flashlight and a notebook, continuing the work of cataloging what remained. She opened more containers, finding not just currency and bonds, but other items that suggested the bunker had been used for purposes beyond simple storage. In one crate, she found maps, not of the local area, but of regions she did not recognize, marked with symbols and annotations that looked military. Another crate held communication equipment, radios and encryption devices that appeared decades old but still intact, their surfaces free of rust or decay. A third contained what looked like personal effects, uniforms folded neatly, dog tags with names she did not know, photographs of men in military dress standing in front of buildings she could not identify. The documents she found were the most troubling. Folders labeled with project names that meant nothing to her, but carried the weight of secrecy. Operation Cold Harbor, Silent Fortress, Black Mountain. Each folder contained pages of dense text, reports and memos and authorization forms, all stamped with classifications that ranged from confidential to top secret. She read fragments, enough to understand that the bunker had been part of something larger, a network of sites used during the Cold War for purposes that remained vague even in the documents meant to explain them. One memo, dated 1979, referenced emergency funding protocols, procedures for moving assets off official ledgers in the event of certain scenarios. The scenarios were listed in coded language, But the implication was clear. This money, these bonds, had been hidden to keep them accessible outside normal government channels, a slush fund for operations that could not be explained or justified through traditional means. Sarah felt a chill as she read, realizing that what she had found was not simply forgotten wealth, but evidence of something deliberate, something that powerful people had once cared enough about to bury deep and seal tight. She closed the folder and set it aside, her hands trembling. The discovery should have filled her with fear, should have made her want to seal the bunker again and pretend she had never opened it. But instead, it filled her with a strange kind of clarity. The people who had hidden this were long gone, retired or dead, their secrets buried with them. The government agencies that might have once cared had moved on, their attention focused on modern threats, not the remnants of Cold War paranoia. The bunker was hers now, not because she had a moral right to it, but because no one else even knew it existed. That realization brought both relief and responsibility. She could not simply take the money and run, could not ignore the documents and the story they told. If she was going to claim this treasure, she needed to understand it fully, to know what risks remained, what shadows might still reach forward from the past to threaten her present. She began reading more carefully, taking notes, cross-referencing names and dates, building a picture of what the bunker had been and why it had been sealed. The work consumed her, became a second obsession alongside the preparation for surgery. She found mentions of funding transfers, millions of dollars moved through channels that no longer existed, allocated to projects that had been shut down or reclassified. She found lists of personnel, some men and women who had served in capacities she could not fully decipher, their names accompanied by clearance levels and assignment codes. And she found, buried in one of the last folders, a memo dated 1986, recommending the decommissioning of the facility and the permanent sealing of the bunker, with a note that all materials inside were to be considered lost to record, no further action required. That memo was the key. It confirmed what Sarah had suspected, but had been afraid to believe. The bunker and its contents had been written off, removed from official existence, sealed not to protect them, but to forget them. No one was coming to reclaim this wealth because, as far as any surviving records showed, it did not exist. The government had closed the file, locked the door, and walked away. And now, decades later, Aunt Sarah had opened that door and found what they had left behind. The knowledge brought both freedom and weight. She was safe as anyone could be in her position, but she also carried the burden of knowing that the money in her hands had once belonged to something larger than herself, something that operated in shadows and secrecy. She could spend it, use it to save her life and build a future for Emma, but she could never fully escape the origin of that wealth, the history that clung to it like the dust in the bunker's air. As the days before her surgery grew shorter, Sarah made her final preparations. She set aside money for Emma's care, arranged for the neighbor woman to stay at the facility while she was in the hospital, and wrote out instructions for everything from feeding schedules to where the important documents were hidden. She did not tell the woman about the bunker, did not mention the wealth beneath their feet. Some secrets were too heavy to share, especially with people whose loyalty had not yet been tested by time. The night before she left for the hospital, Sarah descended into the bunker one last time. She stood in the center of the main chamber, surrounded by containers and crates, by the physical manifestation of a gamble that had paid off in ways she could never have imagined. She thought about the woman she had been when she first arrived here, homeless and dying, clutching a deed bought for $1 and a hope so fragile it barely qualified as belief. That woman was gone, transformed not just by wealth, but by the journey to claim it, and by the realization that survival sometimes required taking risks that looked like madness from the outside. She turned off the flashlight and stood in the darkness, feeling the weight of the earth above and the silence that pressed in from all sides. The bunker had saved her, she knew that. But it had also bound her to something she did not fully understand, a legacy of secrets and shadows that would follow her even as she stepped back into the light. Tomorrow, she would begin the fight to save her life. And when she returned, if she returned, she would face the next challenge that the bunker and its treasures would inevitably bring. Because wealth of this magnitude did not stay hidden forever, and the story she had begun to tell was far from over. The hospital room was white and sterile, filled with the rhythmic beeping of machines that monitored Sarah's vital signs, as though her life could be reduced to numbers on a screen. She lay in the bed the night before surgery, unable to sleep despite the sedatives the nurses had offered, her mind cycling through a loop of fears, both medical and practical. The surgery itself terrified her less than the possibility of not waking from it, of leaving Emma alone in a world that had already shown itself to be cruel to those without protection. She had written letters, tucked them into envelopes marked with instructions about when they should be opened, but the act of writing them had only deepened the ache in her chest. Emma was safe, she reminded herself. The neighbor woman, Mrs. Kowalski, had proven more trustworthy than Sarah had dared hope, like arriving at the facility with supplies and a gentle competence that suggested she had raised children of her own. Emma had cried when Sarah left, clinging to her mother with a desperation that nearly broke Sarah's resolve. But she had also understood, in the way children understand when adults are fighting for their lives, that this was necessary. Sarah had promised to come back, had looked her daughter in the eyes, and made a vow she was not certain she could keep, but would fight, to honor nonetheless. The surgery took 8 hours. Dr. Vasquez and her team worked with precision honed by years of cutting cancer from bodies that wanted desperately to live, removing the tumor along with the surrounding tissue that might harbor invisible threats. When Sarah woke in recovery, groggy and disoriented, the first thing she felt was pain, on sharp and immediate, radiating from the incision site like fire. The second thing she felt was relief. She was alive. The surgery had been successful, Dr. Vasquez told her later, her voice calm and reassuring. Clean margins, no visible spread to the lymph nodes, every indication that they had caught it in time. The chemotherapy would still be necessary, a brutal regimen designed to kill any cells that might have escaped detection. But the worst was behind her. Sarah spent 4 days in the hospital, each one blurring into the next, a haze of medication and monitoring, of nurses checking vitals and doctors reviewing charts. She was not alone. Mrs. Kowalski brought Emma to visit on the 3rd day, and the sight of her daughter's face, anxious but hopeful, gave Sarah strength she had not known she still possessed. Emma climbed carefully onto the bed, mindful of the tubes and wires, and curled against her mother's side. And for a moment, the hospital room felt less like a place of sickness and more like a place of healing. When Sarah was finally discharged, weak but stable, Mrs. Kowalski drove them back to the facility in her old sedan, the road stretching long and quiet through the countryside. The facility looked different somehow, not changed in any physical way, but altered by Sarah's absence, as though it had been waiting patiently for her return. She walked slowly from the car to the common area, her body protesting each step, and when she finally lowered herself onto the bed she had built from salvaged wood and old blankets, she allowed herself to cry, not from pain or fear, but from the simple fact of survival. The chemotherapy began 2 weeks later, a cycle of treatments that would repeat every 3 weeks for 6 months. Each session left her weaker, nauseous, her hair falling out in clumps that she gathered with trembling hands and threw away as though discarding pieces of her former self. Emma, too young to fully understand, but old enough to see the toll it took, became quieter, more careful, as though afraid that speaking too loudly might shatter her mother like glass. But through it all, Sarah held on, buoyed by the knowledge that she had money for the treatments, money for food and warmth, money for a future that extended beyond the next crisis. It was during the 3rd month of chemotherapy that the first complication arrived, not medical, but human. A man appeared at the facility, driving a county vehicle, clipboard in hand, introducing himself as an inspector from the land use department. Sarah met him at the door, her head wrapped in a scarf to hide her baldness, her body weak, but her voice steady. The inspector, a man in his 40s with the weary expression of someone whose job consisted mainly of saying no, explained that there had been complaints. Neighbors, he said vaguely, people who had noticed activity at a site that was supposed to be condemned and abandoned. Sarah invited him in, showed him the repairs she had made, the spaces she had sealed and insulated, the efforts she had put into making the facility safe. The inspector walked through the common area, his eyes taking in the makeshift furniture, the portable heater, the evidence of a life being lived in a place not designed for living. He asked questions, some of them reasonable, others edged with suspicion. How was she managing without utilities? What was her water source? Did she understand that the property was zoned for demolition, not residential use? Sarah answered carefully, threading truth and omission in equal measure. She had rights as the property owner, she explained, and while she understood the zoning restrictions, she was making improvements with the intention of eventually bringing the site up to code. The inspector listened without expression, making notes on his clipboard, and when he finished his walkthrough, he handed her a packet of forms. "Violation notice," he said. "You have 90 days to either bring the property into compliance or vacate. Failure to comply will result in fines and possible seizure." He left without further conversation, and Sarah stood holding the forms, feeling the weight of bureaucracy pressing against the fragile stability she had built. 90 days. It was not enough time, not while she was in the middle of treatment, not while every ounce of energy went toward simply surviving each day. But it was also not a death sentence. She had money now, more money than the inspector could imagine, and money could solve problems that willpower alone could not. She hired a lawyer, a woman named Patricia Hale, who specialized in land use disputes and spoke with the brisk confidence of someone who had fought local governments before and won. Patricia reviewed the violation notice, asked questions about Sarah's ownership and the history of the property, and then delivered her assessment. The county's case was weak, she said. Sarah owned the property legally, and while the zoning was an obstacle, it was not insurmountable. With the right permits and enough documented improvements, they could argue for rezoning, or at minimum, a variance that would allow residential use. The process would take time and money, Patricia warned, but it was winnable. Sarah authorized her to proceed, writing a check that would have been unthinkable months earlier, but now felt like a necessary investment in the future. Patricia filed motions, requested hearings, and began the slow work of navigating the bureaucratic maze that stood between Sarah and the security of keeping her home. But even as the legal battle unfolded, Sarah became aware of other eyes on the property. Trucks slowed as they passed the entrance, their drivers craning to see what was happening behind the collapsed fence. People in town began asking questions, not hostile, but curious, probing in ways that made Sarah uneasy. Where had she come from? How was she affording the improvements? What was her plan for the old military site? She deflected as best as she could, offering vague stories about inheritance money and a desire for solitude. But she could feel the narrative forming around her, the small-town rumor mill turning her into a figure of speculation. Some saw her as eccentric, a woman with more courage than sense, trying to make a home in a place that should have been bulldozed years ago. Others saw her as suspicious, a stranger with unexplained resources, possibly running from something or hiding something they could not yet name. The truth, of course, was both simpler and more complicated than any of them guessed. Sarah was not running from anything except the poverty and sickness that had nearly killed her. But she was hiding something, the bunker and its contents, a secret that grew heavier the more people took notice of her presence. She began to worry that the attention would lead to discovery, that someone, a nosy neighbor or an overzealous inspector, would stumble upon the sealed door, would ask questions she could not answer without exposing the full truth. To protect herself, she took steps. She moved some of the most valuable items from the bunker into a storage unit in a town 2 hours away, renting it under a name that was not quite false, but not entirely hers either. She kept detailed records, not just of the bunker's contents, but of every interaction with officials, every question asked, every form filed. So she prepared for the possibility that the secret would not hold forever, that the treasure she had found would one day attract attention from forces larger than herself. The vindication, when it came, arrived not with triumph, but with quiet resolution. The county hearing on her violation notice took place on a cold morning in early spring. The chemotherapy finally behind her, her hair beginning to grow back in soft patches that made her look younger and more vulnerable than she felt. Patricia presented their case with methodical precision, showing photographs of the improvements Sarah had made, testimonies from engineers who had inspected the site and declared it structurally sound, documentation of her intent to fully rehabilitate the property over time. The county's representative, the same inspector who had delivered the violation notice, argued that the facility remained unsafe, that residential use was inappropriate given the site's history and condition. But his arguments felt perfunctory, lacking the force of genuine concern, and when the zoning board retired to deliberate, Patricia leaned over and whispered, "We've got this." She was right. The board returned after 20 minutes and issued their ruling. Conditional approval for residential use, pending completion of specific safety upgrades within 1 year. Sarah would be allowed to stay, to continue her work, as long as she met the outlined requirements. The relief she felt was physical, a loosening in her chest that allowed her to breathe fully for the first time in weeks. She thanked Patricia, paid her final invoice, and left the courthouse with Emma's hand in hers, feeling as though she had crossed a threshold that could not be uncrossed. But the true transformation came not from the legal victory, but from what Sarah did next. With the immediate threat of eviction lifted and her health slowly returning, she turned her attention back to the bunker, not out of greed, but out of a need to understand the full scope of what she had found. She had been living on a fraction of the wealth hidden beneath her feet, spending cautiously, redeeming bonds slowly, always afraid that too much too fast would draw the wrong kind of attention. Now, with her legal status secured and her medical crisis stabilized, she allowed herself to think bigger. She hired an independent appraiser, someone with no connection to Brennan, and someone who specialized in historical financial instruments and government assets. The appraiser, a man named Dr. Leonard Marsh, arrived with credentials that filled 2 pages and a demeanor that suggested he had seen everything the world of hidden wealth had to offer. Sarah led him to the bunker, watching his expression shift from professional detachment to genuine astonishment as she revealed the contents. He spent 3 days cataloging everything, photographing each item, cross-referencing serial numbers against historical databases, consulting with experts via encrypted calls. When he finally presented his findings, his voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed the magnitude of what he had calculated. The currency alone, adjusted for collectible value and historical significance, was worth approximately $22 million. The bonds, all 78 of them, had matured and compounded over decades, their combined value reaching nearly $296 million. The additional items, equipment, documents, personal effects, while not financially valuable in the same way, held historical significance that could add millions more if sold to the right collectors or institutions. The total, Dr. Marsh said, his voice careful and precise, is $318 million. Give or take a few million depending on market conditions and redemption timing. Sarah sat down, her legs no longer able to support her weight, and stared at the man as though he had spoken in a language she did not understand. $318 million. The number was so large it lost meaning, became abstract. A figure that belonged in news reports about corporations and billionaires, not in the life of a woman who had been homeless less than a year earlier. Dr. Marsh continued, explaining the complexities of redeeming such wealth, the legal considerations, the tax implications, the need for extreme discretion to avoid attracting unwanted attention. He offered his services to manage the process for a fee that was substantial but reasonable given the stakes, and Sarah, still reeling from the revelation, agreed. She signed documents, authorized transfers, set in motion a process that would take months but would ultimately transform the bundles and bonds into liquid assets she could access and use. As the weeks turned to months, Sarah's life changed in ways both visible and invisible. The facility continued to improve, so no longer a patchwork of desperate repairs, but a deliberate renovation guided by architects and contractors who worked under her direction. She had the roof replaced entirely, the walls reinforced, the interior gutted and rebuilt with insulation and drywall and fixtures that turned the common area into a real home. She installed solar panels, a well system, a septic tank, making the property self-sufficient in ways that both honored its history and secured its future. Emma thrived in the transformation, her world expanding from survival to possibility. Sarah enrolled her in the local school, a small building with dedicated teachers who welcomed the quiet girl with the curious eyes. Emma made friends, joined the art club, began to laugh more freely, and, at night, when she asked her mother how they had gone from sleeping in doorways to living in a house with her own room, Sarah told her the truth, simplified but honest. "We took a chance," she said, "and sometimes chances pay off." The people in town, who had watched Sarah with suspicion and speculation, began to see her differently. She donated to the volunteer fire department, funded a new playground for the school, sponsored community events with quiet generosity that did not demand recognition. She was still private, still careful about what she shared, but she was also present, a neighbor who showed up and contributed, and over time the rumors faded, replaced by a grudging respect for the woman who had turned a condemned ruin into a home and a life. There were moments when the weight of the secret pressed down on her, when she wondered what would happen if the truth ever emerged, if someone discovered the bunker and its origins, if the government decided that the memo declaring the contents lost to record was not the final word. But those moments grew less frequent as time passed, as the bonds were redeemed without incident, as the money flowed into accounts managed by professionals who understood discretion, as her life settled into a rhythm that felt, against all odds, normal. Sarah's health improved steadily, the cancer declared in remission after her final scans, her body rebuilding strength with the help of proper nutrition and rest. She stood in front of the mirror one morning, examining the scars left by surgery, the hair that had grown back thicker than before, the face that looked older than her years, but also more certain, and recognized herself not as a victim of circumstance, but as someone who had fought and survived, and claimed a future that no one had believed possible. The bunker remained beneath the facility, most of its contents now removed and converted, but Sarah kept it intact, sealed it again with a new door and a lock only she controlled. It was a reminder, she told herself, of where she had come from and what she had risked to get here. Some nights she descended the concrete corridor and stood in the empty chamber, listening to the silence, feeling the weight of the earth above, and allowed herself to remember the woman who had first opened that door, desperate and dying, hoping for anything that might save her daughter. That woman was gone, transformed by the journey from poverty to wealth, from sickness to health, from despair to something that resembled peace, but she was also still present, woven into every decision Sarah made, every choice about how to use the money, how to raise Emma, how to live in a world that had once discarded her, but now saw her as someone who mattered. Emma turned 8 in the spring, and Sarah threw her a party, inviting classmates and neighbors to the facility that had been transformed into a home with gardens and painted walls and a sense of permanence that felt miraculous. The children ran through the rooms that had once been barracks, played games in the clearing where rusted equipment had once littered the ground, and Emma, bright-eyed and happy, blew out candles on a cake that Sarah had bought without checking the price. Watching her daughter laugh, surrounded by friends, in a home that was theirs, Sarah felt something break open inside her, not painfully but with relief, the final release of fear that had gripped her for so long. They had made it. Not just survived, but truly made it to the other side of the nightmare that had nearly consumed them both. The full story of the bunker would never be told publicly, Sarah decided. The treasure, the documents, the classified operations that had filled those containers with wealth, all of it would remain her secret, a chapter in her life that existed only in the privacy of her own understanding. She had consulted lawyers who assured her that the government's decision to write off the bunker's contents was legally binding, that no agency had standing to reclaim what had been officially abandoned. The money was hers, earned not through labor, but through the simple act of being desperate enough to gamble $1 on a condemned building. But she also understood that wealth of this magnitude carried responsibility. She could not simply hoard it, could not spend it only on herself and Emma, without acknowledging the randomness of her fortune. So she began, quietly and deliberately, to give it away. Not all of it, not even most, but enough to feel like she was balancing the scales in some small way. She established a fund for families facing medical crises without insurance, administered through the hospital where she had been treated. She bought the old community center in town and renovated it, turning it into a place where children could go after school for tutoring and activities. She paid off the mortgages of 3 families facing foreclosure, doing it anonymously through a lawyer so they would never know who had intervened. Each act of giving felt like an exhalation, a release of the burden that came with knowing she had more than she could ever need, while others struggled with the same poverty that had nearly killed her. There were people who asked questions, who wondered aloud how a woman who had arrived with nothing now seemed to have unlimited resources. Sarah deflected with carefully crafted stories about wise investments and a settlement from a lawsuit, lies that were close enough to plausible that most people accepted them without pressing further. A few remained suspicious, convinced there was more to the story, but without evidence, their suspicions remained just that, whispers that faded into the background noise of small-town gossip. One afternoon, not nearly a year after the bunker's discovery, Sarah received a visit from someone she had not expected to see again. The social worker who had tried to help her when she was homeless, the woman who had offered her a bed in a shelter and resources she had been too proud or too desperate to accept, appeared at the facility with a look of astonishment on her face. She had heard rumors, she said, about Sarah's transformation, but had not believed them until she saw the property with her own eyes. They sat on the porch Sarah had built, looking out over the clearing that had been transformed from debris-strewn wasteland to something approaching pastoral beauty. And the social worker asked the question Sarah had been expecting. "How?" she said simply. "How did you go from sleeping in doorways to this?" Sarah considered lying. Considered offering the same vague story about inheritance and luck that she told everyone else. But something in the woman's face, the genuine care that had motivated her to drive out here, made Sarah want to tell a version of the truth. "I took a risk," she said slowly. "I had $1 left, and I spent it on something everyone else thought was worthless, and it turned out to be more valuable than I could have imagined." The social worker nodded, accepting the explanation without pushing for details, and then she said something that stayed with Sarah long after the visit ended. "You deserve it," she said. "Whatever you found, whatever turned your life around, you deserve it. Too many people in your position don't make it. The fact that you did, that you're here and healthy and giving your daughter a real childhood, that's a victory worth celebrating." Sarah thanked her, feeling the weight of those words settle into her chest alongside all the other truth she carried. Deserve was a complicated word, implying a moral calculus she was not sure applied to her situation. She had not earned the bunker's contents through virtue or hard work. She had stumbled into them through desperation and a willingness to gamble everything on a condemned building. But perhaps, she thought, there was a kind of deserving in that too. A recognition that survival itself was a form of earning, that making it through the darkness to the other side carried its own worthiness. As autumn arrived again, marking a full year since she had first walked into the facility with Emma and a sleeping bag, Sarah stood at the edge of the clearing and took stock of what had changed. The buildings were no longer ruins, but structures with purpose, warm and weatherproofed and filled with the evidence of life. The land was no longer abandoned, but tended, cleared of debris, and planted with gardens that produced food they could eat and share. Emma was no longer a frightened child, clinging to her mother in doorways, but a girl with friends and dreams and a future that extended beyond survival. And Sarah herself, looking at her reflection in the window of her home, was no longer the woman who had arrived here dying and desperate. She was someone else now, someone who had learned that the line between ruin and resurrection could be as thin as a single dollar, as fragile as the choice to keep going when giving up would have been easier. The bunker beneath her feet was empty now, its treasures converted and distributed, its secrets sealed again, but no longer holding the same power they once had. She had taken what it offered, had transformed the currency and bonds into a life that felt almost impossible in its ordinariness, in its simple stability. And while she knew that questions would always linger, that the origin of her wealth would always carry the shadow of secrecy, she also knew that the choice she had made, to open that sealed door and claim what lay beyond, had been the right one. Not because she deserved it more than anyone else, but because she had been willing to risk everything on the possibility that something better waited in the darkness. And sometimes, Sarah thought, as she watched Emma playing in the yard with the dog they had adopted from a shelter, sometimes that willingness was enough. Sometimes the universe rewarded not the virtuous or the deserving, but the desperate who refused to stop fighting, who bet their last dollar on a future they could barely imagine, and who, through some combination of courage and luck, found the treasure that changed everything. The facility stood behind her, no longer a phantom of abandonment, but a testament to transformation. And as the sun dipped below the tree line, casting long shadows across the land that was now unquestionably hers, Sarah felt a peace she had thought lost forever. The journey from homelessness to wealth, from terminal diagnosis to remission, from despair to hope, had been brutal and improbable, and marked by secrets she would carry to her grave. But it had also been real, and it had been hers. And standing in the fading light with her daughter's laughter echoing through the clearing, Sarah allowed herself to believe that the story, however unfinished, had already reached its most important conclusion. They had survived, and survival, in the end, was the greatest treasure of all. The call came on a Tuesday morning in late October, nearly 2 years after Sarah had first opened the bunker door. She was in the kitchen of the renovated administration building, making Emma's lunch for school, when her phone rang with a number she did not recognize. Normally, she let unknown calls go to voicemail, a habit born from years of avoiding creditors and collection agencies. But something made her answer this time. Perhaps the area code that matched Washington, D.C., perhaps simple curiosity. The voice on the other end was professional, measured, belonging to a man who introduced himself as Daniel Reeves from the Department of Defense, Office of Historical Accountability. He spoke as though reading from a script, explaining that his department was conducting a comprehensive audit of decommissioned military installations, cross-referencing property records with declassified documents, ensuring that no sensitive materials or assets remained unaccounted for in civilian hands. Sarah's grip on the phone tightened, her pulse accelerating even as she forced her voice to remain calm. She asked what this had to do with her, though she already knew, already felt the ground beginning to shift beneath the stability she had built. Reeves explained that her property, the former communications outpost, had appeared in their audit as a site requiring verification. Not an accusation, so he assured her, just standard procedure. They would need to send a team to conduct a walkthrough, ensure that nothing requiring federal oversight remained on the premises. She could have refused. She could have invoked her rights as a property owner, demanded warrants and legal justification. But she also understood that resistance would only deepen suspicion, would transform a routine audit into something more aggressive. So she agreed, her mind already racing through scenarios, calculating risks, preparing for the confrontation she had always known might come, but had hoped would stay buried in the realm of theoretical possibility. The team arrived 3 days later, 2 agents in dark suits and a technical specialist carrying equipment that looked designed to detect things ordinary people were not meant to find. So Sarah met them at the entrance, Emma safely at school, Mrs. Kowalski warned to stay away for the day. She walked them through the facility, showing them the renovations, the living spaces, the solar panels, and well system, all evidence of a property being used for its intended purpose, residential occupation. The agents were polite but thorough, photographing everything, taking measurements, asking questions about the facility's history and what Sarah had found when she first arrived. She answered honestly about the debris, the broken furniture, the general state of abandonment, but said nothing about the bunker, waiting to see if they would ask directly, if they already knew what lay beneath. It was the technical specialist who found it, or rather, who confirmed what they had already suspected. He walked the perimeter with a device that measured ground density, electromagnetic signatures, anomalies that suggested voids beneath the surface. When he reached the section where the bunker entrance was located, now concealed behind a false wall Sarah had constructed precisely for this eventuality, his equipment began beeping insistently. One of the agents looked at Sarah with an expression that was not quite accusatory, but no longer polite. "Is there something below ground here?" he asked. "A basement? Storage area?" Sarah felt the moment crystallize, the choice between continued deception and partial truth. She chose truth, or a version of it. "There's an old bunker," she said. "I found it sealed when I moved in. I opened it, but it was empty, just concrete and dust." The agent asked to see it, and Sarah led them to the false wall. I removed the panels, revealed the steel door she had replaced after emptying the bunker of its contents. The agents descended first, flashlights cutting through darkness, and Sarah followed, her heart pounding with a fear she had not felt since the early days of her illness. The bunker was indeed empty now. the containers and crates long since removed, the shelves bare, only the concrete shell remaining as evidence of what had once been hidden here. The technical specialist swept the space with his equipment. The agents examined the walls, and after 20 minutes of silence, broken only by the echo of footsteps, the lead agent turned to Sarah. "You said it was empty when you found it?" Sarah nodded, holding his gaze, refusing to let fear show on her face. "Completely empty," she lied. "Just dust and some old furniture that fell apart when I touched it." The agent studied her for a long moment, and Sarah wondered if he believed her, if the training he had received included lessons on detecting lies told by desperate women, protecting the only security they had ever known. But whatever he saw, or did not see in her expression, he chose not to press further. He nodded slowly, made a note on his clipboard, and gestured toward the exit. The team spent another hour above ground, completing their documentation, and then the lead agent handed Sarah a form to sign, acknowledging that the inspection had been completed and no sensitive materials had been found. They left without ceremony, their vehicle disappearing down the dirt road, and Sarah stood in the clearing, feeling the adrenaline drain from her body, and leaving behind a trembling weakness that forced her to sit on the porch steps. She had passed the test, had maintained the fiction that the bunker had been empty, and the government agents had accepted her story, at least for now. But she knew this would not be the end, that her name was now in a file somewhere, flagged for future reference, a woman who owned a former military installation and had access to spaces that once held secrets. That evening, after Emma had gone to bed, Sarah returned to the storage unit, where she had moved the most incriminating documents from the bunker. The folders marked classified, the memos about operations that were not supposed to exist. She spent hours reading through them with new urgency, trying to understand what else might be hidden in the bureaucratic language, on what other threats might emerge from the past. What she found chilled her. Buried in one folder was a memo dated 1985, discussing the establishment of emergency funds for operations that required deniability. The bunker beneath her property was mentioned by designation only, Site 7, but the memo made clear that multiple sites existed, a network of hidden caches spread across the country, each one sealed and forgotten as the Cold War wound down and budgets shifted to new priorities. The memo also mentioned oversight protocols, procedures for periodic verification that the sites remained secure. Those protocols had apparently been abandoned or forgotten, lost in the chaos of government reorganization and the passage of decades. But the fact that they had existed meant they could be resurrected, that someone, somewhere, might decide that the old sites needed to be checked, their contents accounted for, their secrets either recovered or confirmed destroyed. Sarah understood then that her discovery of the bunker had not been the miraculous stroke of luck she had believed. It had been a convergence of timing, of bureaucratic failure, of systems that had broken down just enough to let something slip through the cracks. She had been the beneficiary of institutional neglect, and while that neglect had saved her life, it could not be relied upon indefinitely. She began making plans, not to run or hide, but to insulate herself further from the risks that came with the wealth she had claimed. She established trusts, complicated legal structures that separated her personal identity from the assets she controlled. She moved money through multiple accounts, diversifying it across investments that would be difficult to trace back to a single source. She consulted with lawyers who specialized in asset protection, explaining her situation in vague terms that emphasized privacy rather than secrecy, and they built walls around her fortune that would withstand all but the most determined investigation. The work consumed months, each step careful and deliberate, each decision made with Emma's future in mind, because that, ultimately, was what mattered most. Not the money itself, not the house, or the land, or the security of knowing she would never be homeless again, but the knowledge that Emma would grow up without the fear that had defined Sarah's own life, the terror of one bad month or one unexpected expense destroying everything. Emma, now 9 years old, Anna understood more than Sarah sometimes gave her credit for. She asked questions about where the money came from, why they lived differently than they had before, why her mother sometimes looked worried even when everything seemed fine. Sarah answered with versions of truth, explaining that they had been very lucky, that sometimes good things happened to people who needed them most, and that with luck came responsibility. She also began teaching Emma about money, not in abstract terms, but practically, showing her how to budget, how to save, how to recognize the difference between need and want. She wanted her daughter to understand that wealth was not infinite, that even $300 million could disappear if spent carelessly, that the security they enjoyed required constant attention and wise choices. But beyond the practical lessons, Sarah also wanted Emma to understand gratitude, to recognize that their transformation had been built on a foundation of desperation and risk, and that others still lived in the darkness they had escaped. Together, they volunteered at the homeless shelter in the city, serving meals, sorting donations, listening to stories that Sarah recognized because they had once been her own. Emma saw her mother cry during those visits, saw the way Sarah's hand shook when she talked to women with children, when she recognized the exhaustion and fear that poverty carved into faces. And slowly, Emma began to understand that their life wasn't normal, not something to be taken for granted, but a deviation from a much harsher reality that most people never escaped. Or the second year after the government inspection passed quietly, marked by incremental improvements to the property and Sarah's continued involvement in the community. She funded a scholarship program at Emma's school, covering tuition for families who could not afford the modest fees. She paid for renovations to the town's library, transforming a cramped, outdated building into a bright space with computers and reading nooks and programs for children who needed somewhere safe to go after school. People in town no longer asked where her money came from, having settled into an accepted narrative of inheritance and wise investments, a story that explained enough without requiring details. She was simply Sarah Chen, the woman who had bought the old military site and turned it into something beautiful, who gave generously but quietly, who raised her daughter with a firmness tempered by obvious love. But there were still moments when the weight of the secret pressed down on her, when she lay awake at night, wondering what would happen if the full truth emerged, if someone traced the bonds back to their origin, if the government decided that abandoned did not mean relinquished. Those moments came less frequently as time passed, but they never disappeared entirely. A low hum of anxiety that she had learned to live with the way she had learned to live with the scars from her surgery. On Emma's 10th birthday, Sarah took her daughter to the bunker for the first time, leading her down the concrete corridor with flashlights in hand. Emma's eyes widened at the sight of the empty chamber, the reinforced walls, the sense of something important having once existed in this underground space. Sarah told her the truth then. Not all of it, but enough. "This is where I found what saved us," she said. "This is where everything changed." Emma asked what had been here, and Sarah answered carefully. "Things that people had forgotten," she said. "Things that were supposed to stay buried but didn't. Things that gave us a second chance." Emma nodded, processing this information with the seriousness of a child who had learned that life contained complexities beyond simple explanations. They stood together in the empty bunker, mother and daughter, and Sarah felt the circle closing, the story that had begun with $1 and a desperate gamble reaching a point of completion. Not an ending, because stories never truly ended while the people who lived them continued forward, but a marker, a recognition of distance traveled and transformation achieved. When they climbed back up to the surface, Emma asked if they could keep the bunker as it was, not fill it in or seal it permanently, but preserve it as a reminder. Sarah agreed, understanding what her daughter meant, that some spaces held value not for what they contained, but for what they represented, the possibility of finding treasure in the most unlikely places, the hope that even sealed doors could be opened if you were brave enough or desperate enough to try. The facility stood against the autumn sky, solid and permanent, no longer a ruin, but a home that carried within it the memory of ruin, the knowledge of how close they had come to a different ending. And as Sarah watched Emma run ahead toward the house, her daughter's laughter echoing across the clearing, she felt the final piece of fear release its grip on her heart, replaced by something quieter, but more enduring, a gratitude so profound, required no words, only the simple act of living fully in the life they had built. From nothing, from less than nothing, from a single dollar, and a willingness to believe that tomorrow might be different than today. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.